Who thought when we gained independence, we were free of colonial rule? We typically think of it as political and geographic control. Unfortunately, it's not. We are still under colonial rule. We're trying to get ourselves out. Colonialism was also about systematic and systemic destruction of traditional colonized knowledge systems. There's epistemic and epistemological warfare at its core. Because remember I said no one wants to feel bad about themselves, that they're hateful? If you're on a colonizing mission, and on the other side, you only have savage, barbaric people that have no civilization, then you can feel good. You're bringing civilization to a people. But for that, you have to prove that they have no civilization, that they are savage, they are barbaric. And that is what colonization is all about. Post-colonial studies as a field arose because of the need for post-colonial societies to heal from this damage. It's a field that largely has excluded India and Hindu Dharma, mostly because we chose not to participate, not because there was any intentional malice. And so when we get to the tools section, we'll talk about some of the societies that did choose to participate in the scholarship that they brought on. Now, there are two categories, Anglophone and Francophone. Anglophones wrote in English, Francophones wrote in French. But there was also another angle to it. The Anglophones focused mostly on economic impact of colonization. And it's undoubtable there was massive economic impact. And here we have some scholarship to show that as well. And it's also come into common discourse. Francophones wrote about the psychological impact of colonization. This is a place where we simply didn't do any work until now. And when the Francophones look at it, they say economic impact is there, but because it is a part of the overall damage that is done, we have to look at the overall part. We have to make sure the psychological healing happens as well. And we're hoping that this work and the deconstruction that we've started allows us as a scholastic community to start that process here. We're going to switch to British history. Anyone here study the utilitarian movement in England? Bentham was one of the founders of that movement. He is a tall figure in British history. His disciple was James Mill. James Mill's son, John Stuart Mill, is another towering figure in British history. So what we have is a man stuck in the middle between his mentor and his son, and forgotten in history as a consequence. But this man is the one that wrote our narrative that we suffer from today. Now, he drove the utilitarian reforms in Britain. That's a towering achievement. Now, as part of doing that, or at the start of that effort, he wrote the history of British India. You have to consider the libel laws in Britain at the time when he published. If he wrote strongly against the monarchy, or against the aristocracy, against the clergy, he would have been thrown in jail. So what does a journalist and a budding philosopher do? Remove it from the context of Britain so he can talk about it freely. Then, I'm not talking about you, sir. I'm not talking about the king. Why? I'm free. I don't need to go to jail. And we will prove, and by going through examples of how he did it. Fortunately for him, Indian society was far removed and safe to discuss about in any context he so chose. And so he used that. Now, if we think about his context and some of his words in the opening chapters, he says there's more to learn about India in his closet than there is by ever visiting India. And so he was proud about the fact he never came here. Now, this 3-volume work was amazing for his career because it took him into the East India Company and he rose to its head on the basis of this work. So this text, which started out as a critique on Britain, took a life of its own. Now, he was a prolific writer over the course of his life. As the reforms started to go through, he felt freer and freer to write about Britain in the context of Britain. And so what we can do now is start to look at it and to understand what he wrote and try to draw some connections. But coming back to what he did was he took this work as head of the East India Company And he brought it to East India College, which is where all the civil servants from the East India Company that came to India to govern India were trained. And that became the first institutional teaching of India in Britain. And that set of materials then went to Cambridge and to Oxford, and from there to every other university around the world. And we're now in roughly 6 generations of scholarship, all built on that fundamental paradigm, that fundamental piece of fiction that he wrote.